From an Airbus A320 that blew an engine right before takeoff and a fighter pilot who retracted his landing gear a second too early, to a regional turboprop that flew straight into a highway and much more, here are 10 of the craziest takeoff failures caught on camera. On June 12th of 2025, an Air India Boeing 787 took off from Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport in Ahmedabad, India, bound for London Gatwick with 230 passengers and 12 crew members on board. Conditions were near perfect. Light winds, decent visibility, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, just 3 seconds after leaving the ground, our plane lost lift. Investigation revealed both fuel control switches shifted from run to cutoff. The engines began losing power almost instantly. Cockpit voice recordings captured one pilot asking the other why he cut the fuel. The other pilot denied doing it. The fuel switches were flipped back to run as they tried to recover, and emergency systems kicked in. One engine partially relit, but it wasn't enough. 32 seconds after takeoff, the plane slammed into a medical college hostel less than 2 kilometers from the runway. Of the 242 people on board, only 1 passenger survived. 19 people on the ground were also killed. It was the first fatal crash of a Boeing 787 since the aircraft entered service in 2011. As of early 2026, investigators are still trying to determine what caused those fuel switches to move. On November 18th of 2022, fire trucks were performing an emergency response drill just off the runway at Jorge Chavez International Airport in Lima, Peru. But they believed their drill clearance also meant runway clearance. That's when their drill turned into a real emergency response.
¡Concha su madre! Uy, lo cagaron.
A LaTama 320 slammed into one of the fire trucks while trying to take off, collapsing the right landing gear and detaching the right engine. The plane veered off the runway and caught fire. Thankfully, all passengers and crew evacuated safely, but tragically, 2 firefighters aboard the truck were killed and a third later died from injuries. With over 130,000 planes taking off into the skies each day, a few of them are bound to hit some birds along the way. On April 13, 2023, an Aer Lingus Airbus A330 was preparing to fly from Dublin to Chicago. The plane lined up on the runway, and our pilots pushed the engines to full thrust. They began speeding down the tarmac when a passenger seated near the right engine decided to hit record. What our cameraman captured next was the last thing you'd want to hear on takeoff. The plane was going too fast to abort the takeoff, so the pilots climbed to 3,000 feet before circling back to land. Fire trucks met the damaged plane about 15 minutes later. Aer Lingus swapped in a replacement A330, and passengers made it to Chicago roughly 7.5 hours late. This Edelweiss A320 started its takeoff roll in a mild crosswind. Everything looked normal at first. Our pilots were feeding in a little right rudder to keep her on the center line. Then, at around 140 knots, the plane snapped to the left without warning. A tire blew out during the incident, but the plane managed to stay on the runway. Thankfully, everyone deplaned safely, and the flight to Faro was canceled. On February 23rd of 2017, a Belarusian Air Force MiG-29 Fulcrum began its takeoff roll at Bobruisk Air Base during a military exercise. Everything looked normal as the jet screamed down the runway. Then, our pilot made a critical mistake. He retracted the landing gear too early. For a second or two, the pilot rode it out, probably hoping he could salvage the takeoff before finally ejecting out of his cockpit. Thankfully, the pilot walked away without serious injuries. The jet wasn't so lucky. It skidded down the remaining runway and slid into the trees, leaving a trail of fire and wreckage behind it. On September 1st of 2023, a Delta 767 was preparing to depart from Prague en route to JFK in New York City. They had a long transatlantic haul ahead, roughly 8.5 hours over open ocean, but our pilots never got close. The right engine let out a series of loud bangs followed by streaks of flame. They shut down the engine, declared an emergency, and 21 minutes later, they safely brought her back down to the same runway. Fire trucks rushed onto the runway to inspect the aircraft. Thankfully, everyone on board walked away without a scratch. The 767 stayed grounded in Prague as investigators looked into what went wrong. On August 27th of 2024, a Lufthansa A320 was preparing to take off from Frankfurt, en route to Berlin. As the plane picked up speed, a group of birds crossed its path. Several got sucked into the right engine. The plane was going too fast to abort the takeoff. The crew declared an emergency and climbed to 3,000 feet before bringing her back down to the runway 15 minutes later. Thankfully, nobody on board was hurt, and the plane landed safely. Passengers were shuffled onto a replacement A320 that got them to Berlin about 2.5 hours late. The Handley Page Victor was one of Britain's most legendary Cold War nuclear bombers. It first entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1957 until being retired in 1993. Victor XM715, nicknamed Tease and Tina, hadn't flown in nearly 20 years, but she was kept in taxiable condition, meaning the engines still ran and she could thunder down the runway for the airshow crowds. She just wasn't supposed to leave the ground. On May 3rd of 2009, Victor XM715 prepared for a quick takeoff run. At the controls was 70-year-old Bob Prothero, a retired Royal Air Force squadron commander, and his co-pilot was a volunteer flight engineer with no flying experience. They were supposed to perform a high-speed taxi run, nothing more than a photo opportunity. Bob screamed at his co-pilot to cut the engines, but he froze. He had to take his left hand off the control column and pull the throttles back himself. The moment he did, the 80-ton bomber leapt off the runway. Thankfully, he still had more than half the runway ahead of him. He planted the Victor on the ground and brought her to a stop on the overrun. Nobody was hurt, and the aircraft wasn't damaged. Bob later called it the most terrifying 9 seconds of his life. Maho Beach is the most dangerous beach in the Caribbean, and it's not because of the waves. It sits right at the end of Princess Juliana International Airport's runway on the island of St. Maarten. When jets power up for takeoff, they blast the beach with hurricane-force winds, and every now and then, someone learns that lesson the hard way. On February 4th of 2015, TransAsia Flight 235 took off from Taipei's Songshan Airport, bound for the island of Kinmen. The ATR-72 turboprop carried 53 passengers and 5 crew members. The plane was barely 10 months old. 2 minutes after takeoff, one of the engines flamed out. Now, modern planes are designed to fly on a single engine, so this should have been manageable. But in the chaos, our pilot made a fatal error. He shut down the working engine instead of the failed one. plane simply had no thrust. Without lift, it banked hard to the left, clipping a highway and a taxicab before plunging nose first into the Keelung River. Of the 58 people on board, only 15 survived. Investigators later discovered the captain had actually failed a simulator test less than a year earlier, specifically the engine failure procedures during takeoff, the very scenario that brought his plane down.